This is a short movie to talk about an experiment we've been doing with trying to put RDF data onto a blockchain and also query it. We started off by building a contract that would hold the data itself. So the RDF data we're using is composed of 4 terms. There's a graph, there's a subject, there's a predicate, and there's an object. And here you can see just some of the records that we've put into our test data store. So this particular test data store has 6,852 records in it. So here is part of the contract, and you can see that we're storing the data in several ways. There's a main structure that holds the 4 terms, both the raw data and a hash of the term. And then we have a series of mappings to get to different parts of the data quickly. So basically indexes to look up the data in various ways. One of the things we found is that there is a limit to how much data you can put into a given array. Each time you add a new item, and as the arrays get larger and larger, the cost of that adding the item goes up. So there will come a point, not much further on than 6,852 with the size of data that we're using, and it will vary depending on what those terms exactly are in string form. But we figured we would only get up to probably about 9,000 before adding a new item cost more than the transaction fee. So you basically have a limit to the data you can put on, limited by the transaction fee. So if you're on a private network, we could obviously change the quantities of the total costs of a block and the total data size of a block and all this sort of stuff. But just going with a setup that's very much like the Get Live Ethereum blockchain, you hit limits of the transaction costs. So we thought we'd play with this particular data set. So the first thing we did is just try and pull data out of the data set from outside of the contract based on single terms. So if I take one of these terms, for example a predicate, and query it, it comes back with 434 results matching that particular single term. But this is all just using the RDF data store itself. The second thing we wanted to try and do is build another contract that would use that data store but would act as a search engine that was able to do proper RDF multiple term, multiple row queries. So we wrote an RDF query contract that uses the data store to see what sort of limitations we would hit with that. So this second form uses that RDF search contract. So if we try again putting in a query, let's just start with a single term, but now going through the contract. Let's just put empty terms into the others. So the original idea was we'd build multiple of these and then we'd set them all off and get the results. But let's just run basically the same as calling it from outside, just using the data store but using the query contract. So there are certain stages that the contract runs through. First it initializes a new query with the contract. It then adds this row and it then runs the query, because the idea is that it would have added multiple rows potentially which it needed to store, and then it would run on all the rows that had been added. So that's now gone onto the blockchain, we're just waiting for it to be mined. And now it's initialized the query and it's adding this actual query row that we've added. And now the query is being run. And that's run, and it's basically failed. Let's try a search that returns fewer results. So that returns 17 results, so we know that from testing from external searching of the data store. Now let's try the contract searching that item in the data store. And we'll now go through the same process before, initialize, add the term and run the query.
And there are the results, the 17 as before. We tried many combinations of searches, but anything that returned a large result set failed because basically the transaction trying to run the query ran out of gas. So it seems using the query contract was just too expensive to run. So we've decided to focus now on doing more tests that test the boundaries of the data store contract itself, rather than worry about having a separate contract to do the search terms, and see exactly how much data we could put in an RDF data store.